Hi everyone, and welcome to the Sini Podcast. Sini translates to Chinese in Arabic, and so we are presenting you with a new podcast that focuses on intertwining personal life and research. And we're delving into the lives of Chinese immigrants here within the UAE. My name's Sarah, and I'm one of the hosts of this podcast. I'm a graduate student here at the American University of Sharjah doing my master's in international studies, and I was born and raised here in the UAE. And so when I was little, I noticed that there weren't really many Chinese families or populations here within the UAE in the early 2000s. Within my community alone, I think there were about 3 or 4 families in total. But today, and I think you've also noticed as well, there's a growing influx of Chinese immigrants here in the UAE. So over time, you've seen more of the Chinese language just around on billboards or used as directions, for example, in Dubai Mall, and just a growing life, the bustling life within international study and Dragon Mart. While we can't really pinpoint the exact amount of individuals, we can say that there's approximately 400,000 Chinese immigrants here in the UAE. So that pretty much pushed me, like the exploration of identity and how there really weren't that many, and like the growing influx of Chinese immigrants here pushed me to explore identity, belonging, and language use within the populations here in the UAE. And so that also, studying here in the American University of Sharjah allowed me to be a part of Dr. Yuting Wang's research focused on Chinese immigration and Chinese migrants here in the UAE. So thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Love to hear more about your own personal story as well, being here in the UAE. What made you move here? Why did you stay here for so long, and so on?
Yeah, hi Sarah. Thank you so much for having me and then for helping me with this podcast. And this was actually this podcast is an extension of our projects on Chinese migration, especially the younger generation migration into the region. My name is Yuting Wang. I'm a professor of sociology at American University of Sharjah. I've been here for a very long time. I started teaching in 2009. I'm a Chinese. I finished my undergraduate studies in China about 23 years ago now. I went to the US as a young adult, embarked on my pursuit for a PhD degree in sociology. I was specialized in sociology of religion and then also very interested in global migration. So I found myself really intrigued by the intersection of migration experiences among religious minorities. I came here in my late 20s and I started teaching here, and that's sort of my story. So I've spent my life in 3 very distinctive parts of the world, from China to the US and then to the UAE. That personal interest and my research interests have become combined here and in a very unexpected way in the UAE. When I came here in 2009, as Sarah mentioned, the number of Chinese was very small in the region in early 2000, but we've seen a strong growth, especially after 2013 when the Chinese government rolled out the Belt and Road Initiative. Right? That's Sarah's teenage year. So when we start seeing a lot more Chinese here in the region, and I started actually paying more attention to this interesting trend within the Chinese community. When the Chinese first came here, they were mostly small commodity traders. There were employees in Chinese state-owned enterprises. But then in general, most people would assume, right, the profession among the Chinese community is basically trade and commerce. It's no longer the case. Among those 400,000 Chinese people living in the UAE right now, we found that kind of professional diversity, demographic diversity as well. So from the single man, especially young man, to married couples, and then there's a lot of change. And there's also a new Chinese curriculum, national curriculum school, opened just about 3 years ago in Dubai. This is the first Chinese national curriculum school supported by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, and overseas. So this is something quite significant that has brought me to study. And personally, I think, I myself is a migrant. I just find, that kind of, multi-layered stories of migration is really fascinating.
Yeah, 100%. I think I agree with you definitely, because We live in a very cosmopolitan and very cross-cultural and multicultural society here in the UAE. And so I think looking at these personal experiences, presenting this podcast that allows us to merge sort of personal life stories with the research that you've done, presents a very interesting case of exploring the emotions, the feelings of belonging, and the development of their identities that Chinese immigrants face here in the UAE. I would like to say about my own experience, where it's being born and raised here in the UAE. I came from two different backgrounds. Geographically, they were on opposite ends. My mother is Chinese and my father is Algerian, and so I was exposed to a lot of cultures as a little kid, being born and raised here in the UAE, where not only was I exposed to both Algerian and Chinese cultures, but I was also able to be exposed to local cultures and also other migrant cultures here within the UAE. So I think this pretty much creates a very distinct and complex identity that each individual has, no matter what their experiences are. So I think this podcast would allow us to explore these little tidbits and these smaller details that we might not notice in research, where we are exploring the personal lives of these individuals through their own words and through their own experiences. So I would also like to continue asking you about pretty much what it felt like raising your family in this sort of community as well.
When I came here in 2009, my older daughter was 2 years old. My younger daughter grew up here as well, so they are now both teenagers. My daughter is a junior in high school, so they spent their whole life here, and then I sort of grew with them as well. And I learned more about society, UAE society, through them, through their eyes. And that's another reason why I really wanted to hear stories that young people have, about growing up here in the UAE. That will be our one of our focuses of this podcast, and we wanted to talk to young people. And as I mentioned earlier, the demography of the Chinese community has really shifted over the last 20 years. From the very beginning, you tend to see single young men or women working here in the UAE, but most of them were not raising families here. But today, if you look at the school enrollment, look at the provision for extracurricular activities, and you get a sense that the vibrant community is really growing. There are more families, Chinese families there. So some families involve multi-generations, from grandparents to that added up to the nuclear family. Personally, I think my career, my research really took off because of the strategic location of UAE, the growing relationship between China and the UAE. In 2018, China and UAE elevated their bilateral relationship to comprehensive strategic relationship, and the UAE government also started pushing Chinese Mandarin lessons in public schools. So now we're actually seeing more opportunities for Chinese companies, for Chinese entrepreneurs, and also for Chinese professionals. And so that just extended my sort of my time here in the UAE, and it's a wonderful place to be as a researcher and as a mother, and it's a very safe, secure place. So I think some of my personal experiences also find resonance in our respondents, our guests' stories. But for our listeners, probably don't know, Sarah and I, we had a very long history, right? And I first met Sarah when she was 4 or 5 years old. And Sarah went back to Algeria, right?
Yes,
for a very long time, 10 years or so?
10 years or so for high school, So I experienced different cultures as well, and migrating from one to another,
So she came back to the UAE and started undergraduate studies, and then when we launched the graduate program last fall, and Sarah joined us, and then so she's been working with me. And she's, probably the best research assistant one could ask for, who has a linguistic capacity. And Sarah speaks multiple languages: Mandarin, French, Arabic, and of course English. So we're going to really benefit from her linguistic background, and so that our podcast will be a multilingual one. Given the diverse population here in the UAE, I think that element will also sort of make the podcast really interesting. So you can come here, meet with young Chinese people who have really invested in themselves in local, cultures, and then also getting to kind of, really open themselves up to possibilities.
Yeah, so the linguistic sphere that we've mentioned is, I think, really important, which is why we've integrated it into the podcast, where we're going to have a couple episodes in English, but we'll also look at the different languages that Chinese immigrants also speak. So we'll have other episodes in Chinese, hopefully in Arabic, and any other language that they do speak. So it's really interesting to explore it, because we've talked about how identity, belonging, and language use are three very essential factors into identity construction in general. So I think using that, we'll be able to also introduce not only like our listeners to essentially the different languages that Chinese immigrants have learned being here, also just in general their experiences and being able to hear their voice and what they feel comfortable using.
Definitely, language precedes our thoughts, and then it helps us to understand the world around us, and then to really help us interpret the meanings behind each other's actions. So I think, that multilingual aspect will be really insightful, intriguing. So there's something really, we're all looking forward to with the help of Sarah.
We'll talk to them about their emotions, their feeling of belonging, their identity, and so on. And all of these like deeper topics about how they feel here in the UAE. So we have a couple questions about what it feels like balancing both cultures, what they consider home to be, and also just in general what their relation is to China. But then we're always going to have a little recess within our episodes where we're talking about very lighthearted and like fun hobby topics, looking at what music they like, what show they're watching. We're going to explore also like what social media platforms they like to use, because we have very distinct social media platforms within both cultures. So in the UAE we use Instagram, Facebook, and the like, while in China we have Weibo and what we term the Chinese versions of these apps. So I think this is like the structure of our episodes that will create this sort of like fun, casual setting that will allow everyone to relate to it, because as you mentioned, a lot of these deeper levels of identity can be felt by everyone and not just based on a culture. So I'd like hope for our listeners to also be able to relate to the guests that we'll have in the upcoming episodes, and see what they relate to, what they don't, and feel seen as well.
Yeah.
So
I think what I wanted to highlight is that for the Chinese, and there is sort of traditional narrative about migration, usually between China and in the West. But over the last 2 years, and we've seen that the Chinese have really engaged in this global migratory journeys into these regions that sort of exist outside the Chinese imagination, sort of not really on the mental map of the Chinese people. For example, the Middle East, Africa, and then Latin America, for example. So I think we're really trying to bridge the gap by introducing these personal stories, and connected to our research efforts and to a broad audience. And so we really wanted to invite you as listeners to participate in our small projects, our little efforts, sort of really kind of help to increase to increase understanding of Chinese and then others in the region, and in this very in this very cosmopolitan space.
Yeah. So that's, I think we've touched upon everything about like just introducing. So this is pretty much wraps up the first episode of the Sini Podcast, and we hope that you follow along this journey of exploring the different experiences and personal stories that our guests have. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Yuting. And if for our listeners as well, if you're Chinese and you would love to talk about your own personal experience, I would love for you guys to reach out to the Sini Podcast and be a part of it as well, where your voice is also heard by the public. So thank you so much everyone for tuning in, and stay tuned for the upcoming episodes. I hope they're very, very exciting.
And class dismissed.